Do you believe a loaf of bread can carry a miracle? No, this isn't some metaphor from a self-help book, it's real. In a world where speed trumps affection and most only give when they have plenty, there's a story that will flip your soul inside out. Brace yourself, this isn't about a successful businessman or an influencer who overcame poverty with an online course. It's about an old baker, forgotten by the world, but remembered by heaven. This isn't just a touching tale, it's a direct punch in the gut of the every man for himself mentality. It's about giving without having, believing without seeing, and serving while bleeding inside. In times of inflated egos, this story is a humble love bomb that exposes truths most people run from. You'll see what unconditional love really means, not as theory, but as practice, in the cold, in scarcity, in silence. You'll discover there's bread that feeds the body, and bread that heals the soul. And the most powerful part? This story doesn't end in the past. It's alive, growing, passed hand to hand as a legacy of love. And when you hear the words that changed an entire village, this bread tastes like love, it'll be hard not to cry. But it'll be even harder to walk away the same. So tell me, are you ready to meet the baker who became a legend without making a sound? He would wake before the sun dared to rise. Don Pascual, with hands marked by time and a soul shaped by grief only the silent can carry, was more than just a baker, he was a God's baker. In a village where hope felt distant, he kept the flame of faith alive, his oven burning not just with firewood but with purpose. His bread was more than food, it was bread with purpose, shaped with tears and silent prayers. Even after losing his wife and son, he never closed the door of his little bakery, he kept it open as if it were a living temple of faith. Each dawn, he chose to serve others, even when no one was watching. And the most remarkable thing? He used no machines, had no resources, not even perfect health. His strength came from within, from a faith in hard times that defied logic. The community saw only the gesture, loaves left quietly at doorsteps, but they never witnessed the solitary ritual of kneading each dough with a humble heart. That was the real bread miracle, a man who kept giving without having, a soul forged in pain but softened by compassion. For every batch, there was a silent prayer. For every act of giving, a story of faith no one told, until now. What can we learn from Don Pascual? That true generosity doesn't shout. He didn't seek recognition, his reward was a child's smile with a full belly. And maybe that says more about unconditional love than any book or sermon. He embodied feeding with the heart, offering soul bread with fragile hands but an unbreakable spirit. And that was just the beginning. Because one day, when winter came and resources disappeared, something even more extraordinary began to unfold. The cold came like a thief in the night, silent and merciless. Supplies vanished from pantries, and even people's faith seemed to freeze. But Don Pascual, with only a handful of flour left, made a choice few would. He wouldn't use what he had for himself. Instead, he made 2 loaves and gave them to those in greatest need. That's what we call giving without having. He knew the real miracle didn't come in abundance, but in the decision to share the little. Those loaves, shaped in the stillness of early morning, carried more than wheat, they carried purpose, they carried hope in scarcity. Rather than complain, Pascual knelt to pray. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. He whispered, "If you give me strength, I will keep kneading even when I have nothing." That was his silent prayer, a cry that echoed beyond the cold walls of the bakery. How often do we find ourselves surrounded by lack, money, time, support, and use it as an excuse to freeze? Don Pascual did the opposite, he saw absence as an invitation to trust. That is the mark of a generous soul, someone who walks forward even when no road is visible. For him, every batch was a chance to keep the flame of faith alive, and for those who received the bread, it was a gift that made no logical sense. Many would call it madness, to give everything away while going hungry. But therein lies the beauty. Pascual wasn't driven by logic, but by love. Each piece of bread became a bread miracle, a symbol of unconditional love. And the curious part? Even though he didn't eat, he felt full, from within, fueled by the certainty that he was fulfilling a mission. Have you ever done something for someone without expecting anything in return? It could be as simple as bringing coffee to a coworker on a bad day or writing a handwritten note of encouragement. Small acts like that create massive legacies. And for Pascual, this simple gesture would be the start of something even more divine. It was as if the universe was testing the limits of Don Pascual's faith. The flour had completely run out. The oven, once a symbol of warmth and hope in scarcity, now sat cold and lifeless. But then, a little girl, with wide, honest eyes, appeared at his door with the last bit of flour from her home. "If anyone can bake bread that heals the soul, it's you," she said. That wasn't just childish sweetness, it was the flame of faith in human form. Deeply moved, Pascual went back to kneading. It was a small act, but it would become an eternal lesson in unpretentious compassion. And then, the impossible happened. The dough, which should have made only a couple of loaves, began to multiply. With every stir of the spoon, more volume, more texture, more hope. It was as if that flour came sprinkled with invisible blessings. There was no logical explanation, it was a silent miracle, the kind that doesn't explode in your face, but transforms you quietly. Pascual understood, sometimes God doesn't send angels with wings, sometimes he comes as a child with a pure gesture. The bakery came back to life, not because of ingredients, but because of faith and the generous soul of a little girl. This moment invites reflection. How often do we underestimate the small ones? How often do we expect help from the powerful, when real change comes from those who still believe in miracles? Pascual recognized this, and that day marked the rebirth of his purpose. This was more than bread with purpose, it was spiritual nourishment multiplied by hands guided by something greater. It reminds us to always make space for the unexpected. It might be a student teaching you something new, a stranger offering comfort, or a child showing you the way. And with that same spirit, something magical began to happen before his eyes. The next morning, the impossible came knocking, in the form of children's laughter. A line of kids had gathered in front of Don Pascual's bakery. Without advertising, without promises, he simply opened the door. And as if the oven had heard the faith that fueled him, the dough kept multiplying. Each loaf came out in different shapes, hearts, stars, moons, symbols shaped by tenderness and soul bread. Those children weren't just receiving food, they were receiving care, attention, and something rare these days, presence. It was true sharing with love in its purest form. Even while hungry, Pascual kept nothing for himself. It was as if the act of giving fed him more than the bread itself. What many might call purposeful poverty, he called a mission. With every batch, he gave, a choice made not out of abundance but out of conviction. That's what we call feeding with the heart, a way of life, not an obligation. Think about it, on the hardest days, when you still find the strength to message someone in need, that's it. Giving when your tank is running on empty. Pascual lived this every day, and his little bakery became a place of healing, where even the scent of bread carried hope. The scene was both powerful and symbolic. It was as if the multiplication of love had found a vessel. The children came back daily, not just for the bread, but for the feeling of being in a place where the world still made sense. He didn't have answers for life's pain, but he had warm bread and a sincere smile. And that, unbelievably, was enough to keep the faith in hard times alive. What Pascual didn't know, however, was that the love he was spreading would soon draw the attention of someone different, who would leave no footprints in the mud. It was on a gray afternoon, the kind that hides secrets in the wind, that a young man appeared at the bakery. He had a calm, almost ancient look, as if he knew more than he let on. He asked for a piece of bread, and Don Pascual, now without reserves, offered his last one. The young man took a slow bite, looked into Pascual's eyes, and said, "This bread tastes like love." And in that silence that followed, something different lingered in the air. It wasn't just gratitude, it was reverence. A sacred, intimate moment between a man of faith and someone who might have been more than he appeared. When the young man left, Pascual noticed something strange. There were no footprints. The muddy entrance, always marked by the steps of dozens of children, was untouched. As if no one had passed through. It was a silent miracle, one that leaves more questions than answers. Was it God? An angel? Or a divine sign that Pascual's faith had touched heaven? He didn't need proof, the feeling was enough. That visit was no ordinary encounter. It was a message whispered from above, keep going, you're not alone. And that kind of experience, though rare, makes us pause. What if the most sacred moments in life pass by without making a sound? What if the clearest signs come disguised as simple gestures? Sometimes, it's not the miracle that changes everything, it's the way we recognize it. What that young man said, tastes like love, echoed in Pascual's heart like a silent hymn. That day marked the start of a new phase. Because soon, the one who had always given, would begin to receive, though perhaps too late to save his body. The mornings began to change. Instead of just hungry children, Pascual's bakery now welcomed mothers carrying food baskets, young men bringing firewood, and elders delivering flour wrapped in cloth. It was the silent repayment of a community touched by genuine kindness. His generosity had sparked something, a desire to do good, even without much. This cycle was the essence of a legacy of love, giving not for recognition, but for gratitude. But as his home filled with donations, Pascual's body began to fail. It was clear, he no longer walked with the same strength or kneaded with the same energy. Yet he still repeated like a mantra, the oven must not stop. It was as if his heart was begging his body to hold on a little longer. Julian, a young man from the village, found him collapsed one afternoon, lying among bags of flour. When Pascual came to, he didn't ask for help or rest, he asked that they take care of the bread. That was his sacrifice with purpose, the essence of purposeful poverty, where one chooses to have less so others can have more. A man who chose to serve others, even as his own body was fading. And there, in the warmth of the oven and the quiet presence of children at the door, something new began to form. Julian, once a mere observer, was the first to realize that Pascual's legacy went far beyond recipes or charity. It was an invisible inheritance, made of values and living faith. As someone learning more through example than words, Julian was about to become part of something greater. Because when a man's hands stop, the flame he lit doesn't have to die. The old oven was still warm when Julian, hands trembling and inexperienced, approached the dough Don Pascual had left. The master baker, weak but lucid, dictated instructions between coughs and shallow breaths. The oven must stay open even when my hands can't. That wasn't just a phrase, it was a will. A code of honor. Julian, eyes filled with tears, tried to follow. He kneaded as best he could, shaped the dough, and placed it in the oven. The result wasn't perfect, not even close, but every flaw in the loaf carried a story. It was still bread with purpose, born of effort and the continuation of a dream. More than learning to bake, Julian was learning what it meant to give without knowing if it'll work. He was discovering firsthand what it meant to serve with your heart, not just your hands. Pascual, lying down, watched with quiet pride. He knew the bread might be tough, misshaped, tasteless. But he also knew that the generous soul forming in Julian was worth more than any recipe. That's how true legacies begin, not with applause, but with awkward attempts and lots of faith. Julian was absorbing, unknowingly, the value of a life lived for others. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all, perfection is not the starting point for changing lives, intention is. The first loaf that comes out wrong but is given with love has more power than 1,000 soulless ones. This moment of transition marked the beginning of a new chapter, where past and future met in the heat of an oven and the faith that kept burning. And there, in that little space where a master taught with breaths and a student failed with courage, something was born that no time or illness could erase. That morning, the silence in the bakery felt different. Not empty, but sacred. Don Pascual had passed. His eyes had closed peacefully, and his lips still whispered a silent prayer. There were no dramatic tears, only a shared feeling of deep gratitude. His hands, now still, seemed dusted with invisible flour, as if they had stopped mid-loaf. The man who spent a lifetime feeding with the heart was now resting. But what remained was not absence, but a multiplied presence. The village decided that flowers weren't enough. Instead of funeral wreaths, they baked bread. Each family brought one, some small, others large, all imperfect, but filled with intention. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was the living echo of the bread miracle. Julian, voice trembling, spoke in front of the oven. He taught us to give, even when we have nothing left. That line struck like lightning, a truth the world often forgets but always needs. Don Pascual's humble heart had shaped not just dough, but souls. And think about it, an ordinary baker, without wealth, without fame, committed the crime of loving too much and left behind a legacy more valuable than any material inheritance. This is what a legacy of love really means, inspiring others to live better, not out of duty, but by contagion. The village changed. The children changed. And Julian, he now understood that this farewell was just the beginning of a much larger mission. Because as long as hunger, physical or spiritual, exists, there will always be a need for a new kind of bread. Julian found an old notebook hidden among sacks of flour and worn boards. It wasn't just a recipe book, it was a sacred journal, filled with prayers between the instructions, children's drawings glued inside, and phrases like, "To give is to resist emptiness." With a racing heart, he knew what he had to do, keep the oven burning, not for vanity, but for mission. He founded the taller del Pan del Cielo, where bread wasn't sold, but offered as a symbol of hope. It was the birth of a new generation of God's bakers, ready to share with love, even without abundance. The children kept coming, as if they knew Don Pascual's spirit still lingered in that oven. One little girl, after receiving a star-shaped loaf, looked at Julian and said, "A saint worked here." That phrase echoed in his chest for days. He didn't see himself as special, but he knew he was walking a path laid by something greater. He now understood the meaning of faith in hard times, passed down like yeast from one heart to another. His life wasn't about him anymore. It was about the others. And every loaf handed out was a silent continuation of Pascual's first prayer. And the most beautiful part? The bread still came out imperfect, but never without purpose. Julian learned to fail with love, to try with faith, and to give without certainty. He realized the miracle wasn't in the oven, nor in the flour, but in the act of giving. Of serving. Of keeping alive the spirit of purposeful poverty, where we choose to have less so others can have more. And so, the bakery became a temple. The taller del Pan del Cielo became a symbol of what the world needs most, simplicity, truth, and soul bread. But there was still something everyone needed to remember. Don Pascual left behind no fortune, no bakery empire, no trademark. He left something far more rare, a living example that faith and generosity are multiplying forces. He showed us that even with empty hands, we can still feed with the heart. That in times of lack, we can keep the flame of faith burning, and that true miracles happen when we choose to act even without guarantees. And most importantly, faith doesn't need to be loud. It can be a silent prayer, a warm loaf in the morning, or a quiet gesture with no audience. His bakery became a place of emotional pilgrimage. Outsiders came not just for bread, but to feel the atmosphere where an ordinary man lived in an extraordinary way. Julian, now a true man of faith, continued to teach through actions what Pascual had shown through life. And those who entered understood, that oven didn't just bake dough, it baked values. That's what the world is hungry for. In the end, it wasn't the bread that fed people the most, but what it stood for: unconditional love, sharing with purpose, hope in scarcity. And here's the truth few are willing to hear: what made Don Pascual great wasn't what he had, but what he chose to give. He lived in purposeful poverty, and died as he lived, with hands dusted in flour and a heart free from ego. That forces us to look inward and ask, and us? Are we living a life that leaves marks? Or just footprints that time will erase? His story doesn't end with his death. It continues every time someone chooses to give without having, serve without applause, love without condition. And that is where the real miracle begins. Now that you know Don Pascual's story, ask yourself honestly, what are you doing with what you have? Because this story didn't come to you just to move your heart, it came to shake your soul. Are you giving your best, or just the bare minimum? Are you feeding the people around you with presence, empathy, and love? Or are you waiting to have more before you start giving? Pascual showed us that the little, when shared with love, can transform an entire village. So what's stopping you? What if you applied just a fragment of this in your own life? Cook a meal and give it to someone who's struggling. Visit that elderly neighbor. Donate your time, your ears, your affection. You don't need to open a bakery. You need to open your heart. The world doesn't need more gurus, it needs more ordinary people doing extraordinary good. People with generous souls, with faith in hard times, and the courage to serve others even when there's nothing left. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment below and tell me, which part of this story touched you the most? What hit you? What inspired you? What action are you going to take after hearing this? And hey, if this story made sense to you, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon, and stay with us as we keep sharing the kind of stories this world desperately needs. Because as long as there's a heart in need, there will always be room for another God's baker.